Hey everyone, and welcome to another installment of History of Manga in America. On our journey through the history of manga in America, we have seen the first anime to reach America and the first Japanese property to be licensed for comics in the States. But we still haven't talked about the first bona fide manga to be translated entirely to English for American audiences. That story begins in the underground comic scene of the 1970s. While the newspaper stand reigned supreme for comic book distribution, there were other avenues to get comics. There were smoke shops, record stores, oddity shops, specialty stores, boutiques. Most of the comics available in these outside sources came in unconventional dimensions: ash cans, mini comics, oversized magazine format, all sorts of shapes and sizes. The most popular example being the catalog of Robert Crumb and rip-off press, such as Zap Comics. One such underground comic publisher was Edu Comics. Founded by Leonard Rifus in 1976 as a self-publishing effort for his educational comics, beginning with his own All Atomic Comics, which focused on the dangers and effects of nuclear technology and warfare. It would go on to have 5 printings and featured the works of underground artists such as Melinda Gebbie, Peter Weber, Kevin Brady, and many more. Following All Atomic Comics, Edu Comics would release Mama's Dramas about motherhood, featuring work from more underground talent like Terry Richards, Deborah McGee, and the legendary Trina Robbins. Now, for the uninitiated, Trina Robbins is a legend. Her underground feminist comics became a permanent fixture in the feminist movements of the 60s and 70s, and later in 1986, she would become the first woman to ever draw a Wonder Woman comic with Kurt Busiek writing. Leonard Rifus was an underground comic enthusiast known at the time for his mini-comics, and he had contacts with people like Dennis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink Press, and Kitchen would collaborate with Rifus over the course of the next decade on a variety of projects. Dennis Kitchen later founded the comic book Legal Defense Fund, and with his company Kitchen Sink Press, he would publish works from legends in traditional comics like that of Will Eisner, and even alternative artists like Mark Schultz. One such project was Energy Comics in 1980, which also included the king of underground comics at the time, Robert Crumb, along with others like Greg Irons. Edu Comics was unique among other works from the underground comic scene with its focus on environmental and social causes. It was in 1979 when Edu Comics got in contact with a group called Project Gen in Tokyo, Japan. Self-described pacifists who were enthusiastic about manga, and in particular about spreading awareness about the dangers of nuclear technology, and doing so through the translation and distribution of Keiji Takezawa's biographical work, Barefoot Gen. Now, since 1976, this group had been working on translating Barefoot Gen about the real-life experiences of its creator Neiji Takezawa following the bombing of Hiroshima. The manga originally ran in Japan from 1973 until 1987 and was widely celebrated for its stark depiction of the realities of nuclear war. Edu Comics also had a story with Japanese artist Akira Narita in the anthology comic Food Comics. Written with Leonard Rifus and Frederick Schott, it's possible that this story in Food Comics represents the first actual collaboration between Japanese and American talent in the creation of a comic. Now, Schott was a manga enthusiast whose involvement in the early days of manga cannot be understated. He would act as a translator for early manga, and an interpreter for artists in Japan for people such as Osamu Tezuka, and he's perhaps best known for his book Manga. Along with Akira Narita, Food Comics also included work from Trina Robbins and Robert Crumb, making this a very unique artifact of the underground comic scene of the early 1980s. In 1980, Edu Comics released the first issue of Barefoot Gen, then titled Gen of Hiroshima. This would represent the first instance of manga translated and released in its original form for American audiences. Yes, Barefoot Gen was the first manga to be released in America, and it was released in a standard American comic book format, opening from right to left, reading from left to right like every other American comic. Manga is originally released in a format that was far too complicated for American publishing. Japanese manga is traditionally read right to left, and it's open from left to right, reverse of American comics, and this proved as a huge obstacle for early attempts at translating the manga for American audiences. This conundrum about how to translate and present Japanese comics plagued the production process for publishers until the mid-90s, when Viz began releasing their comics and graphic novels right-to-left format, along with Tokyo Pop releasing tankobon formatted books in Borders bookstores. Following this came a second issue, and then a one-shot called I Saw It, another biographical depiction of Nakazawa's experience in Hiroshima, and it had actually debuted in Japan as a sort of pilot for Gen of Hiroshima. These 3 issues would represent the first real attempt to bring Japanese manga to American audiences, but the Japanese market of the 1980s and EduComics' unorthodox approach to comic publishing left these early manga relics in obscurity, and they were not entirely popular to the general comic book audience. These factors led to EduComics fading into the background as Leonard Rifus would go further into education, teaching cartoons to all age groups, and in 1988 he was involved in AIDS News, an educational comic about AIDS. And earlier in 1982 he was involved in a comic for the Institute for Food and Development called Food First Comics. It wouldn't be until 2004 that Barefoot Gen in its entirety would be released in all 10 glorious volumes from Last Gasp Publishing. Its anime was released in 1992 with subtitles, and again it was released with dubbing in 1995. And so that's the story of the first manga to come out in American comic book stores. The 1980s were a time with countless titles proliferating comic book shops, and in that sea of black and white self-published comics, Gen of Hiroshima made its humble debut. A year after the release of I Saw in 1983, Manga by Frederick Schott would introduce a new audience to the cultural and social importance of manga in Japan, and the book would feature Nakazawa's work as well as work from a handful of other seminal mangaka, but that would be a story for another day. Thanks for listening. Go and check out some of the other videos. Drop a comment, let me know what you think, or if there are some other topics that you'd like me to cover in the future.